She was standing in the hallway in a towel, hair dripping onto the hardwood, and when I tried to apologize, she just looked at me and said, "Don't apologize. Just take responsibility." I stood there for what felt like a full calendar year. I didn't say anything. I just nodded like that made sense, stepped back into my room, closed the door very quietly, not a slam, just the careful click of someone trying very hard to seem composed, and then sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for probably 4 minutes. I want to be honest about that detail. 4 whole minutes. Not moving, not reaching for my phone, just sitting there with my hands on my knees, thinking about what that sentence meant and why it had landed somewhere well past the situation it technically described. I have replayed that hallway maybe 200 times since. I expect I always will. So, hi, my name is Marcus. I'm 31 years old. I'm an HVAC technician, which means I spend most of my working hours in other people's attics or crawl spaces, diagnosing problems that the house has been quietly managing for years before anyone paid attention. A compressor running a little hotter than it should every summer. A duct joint leaking conditioned air into a wall cavity one cold season at a time. Problems that announce themselves slowly. The utility bill that climbs by small increments. The one room in the house that never quite gets comfortable. And that people learn to live around until something stops working entirely and everyone acts surprised. I am the person they call when the surprise has run its course. I like the work. There's something clarifying about it. The problem exists. The evidence is there if you know what you're looking for. You find it, you name it, you fix it, or you tell someone honestly that it's past fixing in its current form. No interpretation required. I have always done better with problems I can put my hands on. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city, the kind of city where parking is a daily negotiation and at least 3 people in any given neighborhood know each other from a thing that happened years ago, and no one fully explains. I've lived there for 4 years with my best friend Danny, who I've known since we were both genuinely, impressively bad at soccer in the 5th grade. Our coach that year was a man named Ron, who had the specific tired grace of someone who had made a promise to a church youth program and was honoring it on pure principle. Danny and I bonded over being benched at the same time during a game we were losing by a score I've chosen to forget. Some friendships start with shared triumph. Ours started with shared irrelevance to the outcome, which I think made it sturdier. I should also tell you that I'd been living alone in the comfortable sense for a while before Danny. Not alone, but alone in the way you can be when you're in something that stopped being fully real a while before it officially ended. I dated someone named Jess for almost 3 years. She was good. I was good. We were good in the way that looks like the real thing from the outside and feels like an approximation from the inside. And I spent the last year of it telling myself I was probably just being overly analytical, that I just needed to commit to the idea of it more fully, right up until she sat me down and said she didn't want to be someone's approximation of a thing they actually wanted. And she was right, and I knew she was right, and I still felt like I'd walked into a wall. That was 2.5 years before Claire showed up in our hallway. I'd made myself comfortable with the idea that I was one of those people who did better in the structural companionship of a good friendship and a job that made sense and a routine that didn't ask too much of anyone. I thought, fine. I was, as Danny later put it, fine-shaped. There's a difference, and at 31 I'd stopped noticing it. The comfortable truth about loneliness, when you've been in it long enough, is that it stops feeling like a condition and starts feeling like a preference. You stop running the comparison. You stop asking whether what you have is the same as what other people mean when they talk about being happy. I liked my routines. I liked the job, which gave me problems with clear solutions and the satisfaction of solving them. I liked living with Danny, who was easy company and didn't demand anything I wasn't willing to give. I'd arranged my life into something that asked very little of me emotionally and told myself this was just how I was built. Some people need a lot. I needed less. I was, in my own accounting, doing fine. I was not keeping a running tally of what the fine was costing me because that kind of accounting requires admitting there's a deficit, and I had gotten very skilled at not running those numbers. I had met Danny's sister exactly twice before all of this happened. The first time was at a birthday dinner for their mom. I'd been included the way people get folded into family occasions when they've been present long enough to be considered ambient furniture. Claire sat across from me. She was perfectly polite. She ate. She answered questions when they came her way. She had the measured energy of someone who had accepted the evening's parameters and was moving through them in order. She spent portions of the meal reading something on her phone with the unself-conscious focus of a person who finds her own company genuinely sufficient. I didn't take it personally. The second time was a holiday party 2 winters later. We stood near the same table of food for about 6 minutes, exchanged the kind of conversation that fills space without leaving a mark, and then she left early with the ease of someone who had never felt obligated to stay past the point of her own comfort. She seemed sharp. She seemed like she had things she was getting back to. I remembered her as composed and self-contained, and unlikely to need much from the people around her, which, it turned out, was exactly half correct. Her name is Claire. She's 28. She works as a veterinary technician at a specialty clinic, the kind that takes the cases general practices send over when something is complicated enough to require more. She works with animals in pain that cannot explain where it hurts, with owners in fear that can't always be reasoned with colleagues making judgment calls under pressure from information that's never complete. It turns out that matters. I'll come back to it. She came to stay with us for 2 weeks while her apartment building was being fumigated. A pest control situation discovered in the walls during routine maintenance, the kind of thing that's invisible until it isn't, which, as I've noted, I have some professional appreciation for. The building management scheduled treatment. Tenants had to vacate for 14 days. Danny offered our couch before he'd finished the sentence describing the situation, then upgraded the offer to the guest room sometime before he got around to mentioning any of this to me. He told me on a Thursday evening with the settled confidence of a person who does not anticipate objections. I didn't have objections. She was family. It was 2 weeks. It was perfectly reasonable. Danny told me Thursday. She arrived Saturday with 2 efficiently packed bags and a cat carrier containing a 17-year-old orange cat named Gerald, who Danny had entirely forgotten to mention, and who spent his first 3 days in our apartment under the guest room bed producing a low, continuous sound I can only describe as the vocal expression of deep institutional mistrust. The first 2 days we were polite to each other in the particular way of strangers sharing a temporary space, that specific careful courtesy where both people are working hard to demonstrate that they are easy, that they require nothing, that their presence is not an imposition. Good morning offered to the kitchen rather than directly at anyone. Is this your mug? With the mug already returned to the cabinet before the answer arrives? Sorry, I'll move my bag before anyone has had to navigate around it. The kind of coexistence where you are both performing consideration so consistently that you have almost no actual exchange at all. She kept her things extremely organized, which I noticed on day 1 and kept noticing because it was deliberate and consistent in a way that stood out. Her shoes by the front door spaced with unconscious evenness. Her toiletries on the bathroom shelf arranged by function. I worked that out by day 3, not by size or brand the way most people do it, but by use, so that what went together in practice stayed together at rest. Her jacket always on the same hook. Her charger coiled rather than left in a heap. Every morning the guest room door closed the same way. Her space maintained against the entropy of a shared apartment with a kind of quiet, ongoing intention. There was care in it. There was also, I sensed even then, something structural about it that I didn't yet have context for. Danny gave me some of that context a few days in. She'd always been organized, he said. That was fixed, all the way back. But it had gotten more deliberate, more necessary feeling in the last couple of years. There had been a relationship that ended in the way relationships end when one person needs things to be a certain way, and the other person decides that's a quirk to be waited out rather than a language to be learned. There had been some hard months at work after that. She was fine. She was always fine. She was fine with such consistency and such thoroughness that you had to look at the architecture of her daily life to understand what the fineness was costing. I filed all of this in the category of things I was aware of without acting on and went back to whatever I'd been doing. That was one of my skills. On day 3, something shifted. There was no event. It was just that I came home from a job in the suburbs, Long drive each way on a hot afternoon, an attic with no cross ventilation, a compressor that had been running in quiet mechanical distress for the better part of 6 months while the homeowner noted the sounds and decided they probably didn't mean anything urgent. Talwa. And I was tired in the specific way that empties rather than just exhausts. The kind of tired where you're too depleted to want company, but too hollowed out to want quiet. I came into the kitchen to figure out dinner, and she was already there, sitting at the counter with a thick medical textbook open in front of her and a glass of water sweating a slow ring onto the page she was trying to read. She looked up when I came in and said, without any particular preamble, "You look destroyed." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Bad job?" I said, "Just long." The house had been trying to tell them something for a while and they weren't listening. There was a lot to fix by the time I got there. She considered that. "That happens with animals," she said. "The owners aren't always paying attention, or they notice something and tell themselves it'll resolve. By the time they bring the animal in, whatever the problem was has been working on them for months. Things that have been running wrong for a long time are harder to fix." I held that for a second. I didn't have a response that wouldn't have been too much, so I just started making pasta. She stayed. The textbook gradually stopped being the point of the evening. We talked about our days the way people do when the days have been long and there's someone in the same kitchen who will listen without requiring anything of the listening. She told me about a dog who'd eaten an entire athletic sock at some point in the preceding 48 hours and had arrived at the clinic that morning with the full dignity of someone who had done nothing wrong and would not be entertaining questions about it. I told her about the homeowner who'd followed me around the attic asking whether I thought it could be a ventilation issue. Was it ventilation? Did I think maybe ventilation? What was my read on ventilation? While I was explaining with what I hope was patience, that the unit had simply been running past its useful life for 2 years and wanted to retire. She laughed at that. Not a polite laugh, a real one, a little sudden, like she'd been caught off guard by it. I noticed it. I filed it. By the time I'd eaten and cleaned up, the hollowed-out feeling I'd walked in with had mostly lifted. I cataloged that too, set it aside, and went to bed. But I lay there for a while before sleep, which was unusual for me. I was typically the kind of person who fell asleep within minutes of horizontal, the mechanical fatigue of the work doing what it was supposed to do. That night, I was just awake, not anxiously, just awake, and I lay there thinking about the conversation in a way that wasn't quite thinking, more like running a hand along a surface in the dark to figure out what it was. I talked to her for maybe 40 minutes total. She'd listen the way people listen when they're actually interested and not just waiting for their turn. She'd offered something back in kind, the sock dog, the diagnostic parallel, and without making it about herself. It had been the most normal possible thing, and I couldn't stop turning it over. I didn't examine why. I was excellent at not examining why. By the end of the first week, there was a routine. Neither of us had proposed it or negotiated it. It had assembled itself out of small, repeated decisions that were easier to make than to examine. She made coffee in the morning and always made enough for 2, which I noticed she did not extend to Danny. When I pointed this out, she said Danny put sugar in coffee like a person who had simply stopped caring about himself, and she wasn't going to be part of that. I started leaving the kitchen light on when I stayed up late because I'd established by day 4 that she did better work with more ambient light, even though she'd never mentioned it and probably hadn't consciously noticed the difference. Gerald, the ancient cat, had by day 5 abandoned the guest room bed in favor of the armrest of the main couch, where he held court with the immovable authority of something that has been alive long enough to have opinions about furniture. One evening she put on a documentary, Animal Migration Continental Scale, and I happened to still be on the couch and didn't get up. She explained things during it the way people do when they know a subject with real depth, and the knowledge wants out, not performing, just sharing, like the impulse was simply stronger than the habit of holding it back. I asked questions because I was genuinely interested, and because every time I asked one, she turned a little more toward me, engaged. The guarded quality that she wore like a second layer of clothing loosening just slightly. She had opinions about migration patterns. She had a framework for thinking about what animals were doing and why that was specific and thought through and not what I would have expected from someone I'd mentally categorized as composed and self-contained. I kept asking. She kept explaining. Gerald made a sound on the armrest that I interpreted as approval. At some point, I looked at the clock and it was 11:52. Neither of us had moved in about 2.5 hours. I said, I didn't know any of that. She said, most people don't ask. I said, their loss. She looked at me for a second with something evaluative in it, then looked back at the screen. Yeah, she said, like she was agreeing about something slightly different than the documentary. I didn't examine it. I went to bed shortly after and told myself the evening had been pleasant and uncomplicated, and I was going to leave it there. Danny noticed. Danny has the social perception of someone who has devoted real leisure hours to the study of group dynamics through competitive reality television and applies those skills to actual life with a frequency that is both impressive and occasionally difficult to be around when you are the subject. He waited until Claire had left for an evening to meet a friend, gave it 10 minutes to ensure she wasn't coming back for something she'd forgotten, and then came and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the settled intention of a person who has prepared something. He said, so? I said, no. He said, I haven't said anything yet. I said, you have a face. The face indicates an incoming thing. He said, I was going to say she seems comfortable around you. That's not her default setting. I have known her for her entire life, which is 28 years, Marcus. I have been aware of this person for 28 years, and I am telling you that she does not get comfortable around people quickly, and especially not recently, and especially not around men she doesn't know well. He leaned back in the chair. She laughed at something you said yesterday. The real laugh. The one I have been trying to produce for approximately 8 months and have not been able to, and I am objectively funnier than you. I said, I genuinely disagree with that assessment. He said, it's not the point. The point is that something is happening here, and you have put it in the very organized box you put things in when you've decided you're not ready to look at them, and you've labeled the box something boring and closed it. I said, that's a lot of analysis for a roommate situation. He said, it's not a roommate situation. He was quiet for a second. She's had a hard couple of years, not in a way she'd want me talking about, so I won't go further than that, but she's been careful. More careful than usual about who she lets in, about what she gives away, and she is not being careful around you. She's just not. And I think that means something. He let that sit. I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing. I told him he was constructing a narrative from circumstantial data. He gave me the look he gives when someone says something he considers factually incorrect, but he's choosing to be gracious about. Danny was not a person who invented things that weren't there. He was a person who saw clearly and spoke without the delay most people impose on themselves. I thought about what he'd said for longer than I'd wanted to. I thought about the documentary. I thought about the mug in the morning, how she'd known without being told. I thought about the way the apartment had started to feel different with a third person in it. Not crowded, but inhabited in some fuller way, like a room with better acoustics. I thought about all of it, and then I did the thing I did, which was to put it in the box marked complicated and close the box firmly and go to sleep. I was, as previously noted, genuinely skilled at this. It had taken years to develop. I was not going to abandon it on a Thursday because Danny had made eye contact at me across a kitchen table. I went to my room and I lay on my bed and I watched something I still cannot tell you a single thing about. The hallway incident happened on day 11, 4 days before she was supposed to leave. I'd misread the bathroom timing. I thought she was still in the kitchen. She'd finished ahead of what I'd registered, and we arrived at the same narrow corridor from opposite directions at the same time. It was the geometry of an apartment that is designed for 2 people and is presently housing 3. She was coming out. I was going in. There was a moment of mutual recalibration in a space that didn't have much room for it. I started apologizing before I had fully processed what was happening, which is my default. I apologize for occupying shared space the way some people say ow before they've confirmed anything actually hurts. The word just exits. She raised one hand and stopped me. Don't apologize. Just take responsibility. She walked past me, calm as a house that knows its own structure, and went to the room at the end of the hall and closed the door. Not hard, just closed. I stood there for a moment, Then I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, and that was when the 4 minutes happened. Here's the thing about apologizing versus taking responsibility. I know this distinction professionally. When a system fails, apologizing to it does nothing. Apologizing is about the apologizer, it's about managing the discomfort of having caused a problem, about asking not to be held accountable by preempting the accounting with feeling. It is a deflection. Taking responsibility means something different. You identify the fault, you name it without softening, and then you address it. Not the feeling, the actual thing. I sat on my bed and I turned this over, and I knew, somewhere below the level at which I was willing to think it directly, that she was not talking about the hallway. She had not been talking about the hallway at all. The next morning I was up before 7. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. Not for me first, I made 2 cups, and I fixed hers the way I knew she took it. The particular ratio of oat milk I'd first observed on day 2 and had been buying a carton of for the first time in my adult life, because it was what she needed, and I had a kitchen. I left her mug at the specific spot on the counter where she always sat. Then I sat down across from it and waited. There is no way to make that sound less exposed than it was. I was just sitting there across from a mug of coffee I'd made for someone who hadn't asked for it yet, hoping she'd come in and understand what it meant without me having to explain it. Which is, I realize, exactly the kind of emotional indirection I'd spent 2 weeks accusing myself of. At least it was a start. She came in about 20 minutes later. She stopped when she saw the mug. She stood with one hand still on the door frame for a moment, just looking at it. She said, "You noticed." I said, "Hard not to." She said, "Danny has never once noticed. 4 years." I said, "Danny notices things that are in Danny's immediate field." She laughed. That specific laugh, unguarded, a little surprised by its own arrival, the sound of something that got out before she decided to let it. She sat down with the mug, and I sat across from her, and we had the most ordinary possible breakfast. Toast? Coffee? The morning light coming in at that sideways low angle that makes kitchens feel warmer than their actual temperature, and I sat there with the thought I had been very successfully not sitting with, which was that I had gotten genuinely used to this, all of it, the mug at the right color, her at the counter with a textbook or her phone, the way Gerald materialized in the kitchen doorway every morning to conduct what I'd started privately thinking of as a wellness check. I'd gotten used to the whole shape of it, and I didn't want to unget used to it, and I could no longer sustain the pretense that this was a temporary housing feeling. She was leaving in 3 days. 2. 1. The night before she was supposed to go, Danny found me in the kitchen cleaning things that did not need cleaning. He stood in the doorway reading me the way he had since we were 11 years old, and I'd had a crush on a girl in our grade and reorganized my locker twice in 1 week. He said, "She's going to drive back tomorrow, and you're going to say something like 'drive safe' and do the standing wave, and then spend the next several months being fine in the way where it's actually not fine." I said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, Danny." He said, "You knock on the door and you say the true thing, whatever it is. Just the true thing." He came in and sat at the table. "You spent a year after Jess being fine-shaped. You walked around in the correct configuration of a person who was okay, and I watched you do it for 12 months. And this isn't Jess, I'm not saying it's the same. But I know what you look like when you're working very hard to argue yourself out of something real, and you have had that look for at least 10 days. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. "She came down around you. That's not nothing for her. Don't let it be nothing because you're scared of the sentence." He grabbed his keys. "He said he'd be back." He said it in a way that made very clear he would not be back soon. I stood in the kitchen for a few more minutes. Then I walked down the hall and knocked. I want to tell you I had something prepared. I had absolutely nothing prepared. I knocked before the deciding was completely done, which is either courage or just forward motion, and I'm not certain the difference always matters. She opened the door and looked at me with that particular expression. Part patience, part assessment, waiting to see what I'd actually brought before she committed to a response. She was holding a book. Behind her, the handwritten list on the desk was open, numbered, organized. Several lines crossed through with a single neat stroke. The logistics of tomorrow laid out in sequence, her life prepared to resume. I said, I don't want to not know you after tomorrow. She said, that's grammatically complicated. I said, I know. This is genuinely not my strongest area. She said, you're actually pretty good at it. You've just spent a lot of time convincing yourself otherwise. I said, you're doing the thing. She said, what thing? I said, the thing where you name the actual problem when everyone else is discussing something adjacent to it. Something shifted in her expression just slightly. She said, it's a reflex now. You spend long enough with patients who can't tell you where it hurts, you start listening differently. You pay attention to what people do instead of what they say they're doing. You learn to read what's actually there. I said, I know the feeling. Different field, same principle. I held that for a second. I made the coffee the right color every morning after the first few days. I left the light on because I noticed you worked better with it. I've been finding reasons to be in whatever room you were in for almost 2 weeks. And I've been filing it under friendly and temporary, and she's Danny's sister, all of which are technically facts and none of which is the actual point. And I don't want to keep apologizing for things I actually meant to do. I want to do something different instead. She was quiet. A real quiet. The kind that has weight. She looked back at the list, then at me. She said, I have a system. I said, I know you do. She said, the system isn't just how I am, it's how I hold things together. It's been doing that for a couple of years now, and I've had people treat it like a phase, like I'd eventually just relax and let go of it. That's not something I can go through again. I said, I'm not asking you to let go of anything. I think your system is one of the more interesting things about you. I'm asking if there's room in it for someone who will actually pay attention, not manage things, not fix things, just be someone you can call when something breaks, the real kind. She was quiet again. She looked at the list. Then slowly she picked up the pen, turned to the bottom of the page, and wrote something below the last numbered line. She turned the notebook so I could see it. Below all the organized, numbered, practical things, the crossed off tasks and tomorrow's logistics, it said Marcus. No number assigned, no explanation, just my name. I said, is that a system? She said, it's a start. I went back to my room and didn't sleep for a while, not in a bad way. In the way that follows a shift when the new arrangement of things is still settling and you're lying there taking stock of the fact that something has changed and it changed in the direction you wanted. She left the next morning. She packed efficiently and quickly, which I should have expected. The bags went back to their compact starting configuration. The guest room was restored to its pre-occupancy condition with a thoroughness that seemed almost pointed. Except I'd come to understand that it was just how she did things. She had borrowed the space and she was returning it in full. Gerald went into his carrier with the ancient and dignified resignation of someone who has outlived many situations and simply waits them out. Danny stood in the kitchen doorway eating cereal with the expression of a man at the final scene of something he had correctly predicted from the opening frame. We exchanged numbers in the hallway by the front door, which felt simultaneously like a very small administrative thing and like something else entirely. She typed her number into my phone and handed it back, and I stood there holding it, and she said, I'll text you. Not text me sometime. I'll text you, like it was already decided. I said, okay. She said, okay. She picked up Gerald's carrier and the 2 neatly packed bags and walked out, and I stood in the doorway watching the elevator close. She texted before she'd reached the highway. It said, I added to the list on the drive. Good things. I stood in the hallway and read it twice over and then went back inside and told Danny she'd arrived safely, which was not technically what the text had been about, and he looked at me and then looked at his cereal and said nothing, which was the kindest possible response. 3 weeks later, she came over for dinner. No practical reason. She just came. She brought a bottle of wine she'd chosen because she remembered from one passing mention weeks earlier that I liked something dry and red. She sat at the counter while I cooked and spent a while explaining avian respiratory physiology in a way that was genuinely fascinating, and I kept asking questions, and Danny sat on the couch with the television on at a volume that no one was pretending was adequate for actual watching. At one point he said, without turning around, I want to be clear that I'm not going to say I told you so. Claire said, You're saying it. You're saying it right now. He said, I'm saying it so quietly, though. Barely qualifies. She looked at me. I looked at her. She pressed her lips together in the particular way that meant she was logging something for later. After dinner, she stayed for the dishes, which she didn't need to, and at some point, we were standing at the sink next to each other, and she said, without quite looking at me, I've been adding things to the list. I said, Good things? She said, Yeah, good things. I dried the last dish, put it away, and said, You knew I noticed the coffee thing. The first morning I made it for you, you knew before I said anything. She said, I knew. I said, You planned the original coffee, the first week. You knew I was paying attention. She said, I have a system, Marcus. And she smiled. The same way she laughed, a little caught off guard by its own arrival, a little unguarded. And I thought that was the actual thing about her, that someone who had built all that structure, all those numbered lists and careful arrangements, all that deliberate load-bearing architecture of daily life could still be surprised by her own warmth, that the order and the softness were both genuine, both entirely hers, and one did not diminish the other. That was what I hadn't expected, and what I'd been quietly thinking about since approximately day 4 of 2 weeks. That was 2 years ago. She moved into the building 8 months after the fumigations, a unit 2 floors above ours, her own space, the system entirely intact and entirely on her terms. And I have a key that we described as practical when the subject came up, and that we both understand was never really about practicality. Danny claims full and sole credit for the outcome. We let him. It costs nothing, and it means a great deal to him, and some debts are worth paying in the currency of someone else's satisfaction. He's earned it, honestly. He saw it before either of us did. Her list is very long now. I've never read the whole thing. That's hers, and that matters. That boundary is real. But sometimes I stop by in the evening, and she's working at the desk, and I can see the notebook from across the room. I know my name is in there. Not at the bottom anymore. Somewhere in the middle, which tells you everything if you understand how she thinks. The middle is where things go when they've stopped being new, when they've become part of the structure, when they're not an addition but a load-bearing element. She used that phrase first, and she was right about it. She still says it sometimes. Don't apologize. Just take responsibility. Not in heavy moments. In the ordinary ones, which is where most of life actually happens. When I've left the cabinet doors open again. When I've been avoiding a phone call I know I should make. When I'm apologizing for something I meant to do, using the apology to avoid owning it. And every time I hear it, I'm back in that hallway for a second. The towel, the dripping hair, the 4 minutes on the edge of my bed. The thing I thought was a small, embarrassing moment I would stop thinking about in a day or two, and that turned out to be the house talking. Telling me something that had been working on me since before I was willing to hear it. Something I should have addressed earlier, but I got there. I found the thing, I did the work. The system has been running well for 2 years. In my professional opinion, that's a very good sign. There's a thing that happens in the work I do when a system that's been repaired starts running correctly. It sounds different. Not louder or quieter, just right. The right frequencies, the right intervals. You can hear a well-functioning system the way you can hear a conversation where both people are actually saying what they mean. There's an ease to it that the straining, compensating, almost working version never quite has. I've gotten very familiar with that sound over the years. I know it when I hear it. 2 years in, I hear it all the time. She keeps a small cactus on her windowsill that she's had since vet school. It's not much to look at. A squat, unassuming thing in a terracotta pot that she's had for 6 years, that has survived 2 moves and a fumigation and whatever condition she subjected it to in her first apartment. She told me once it was the first living thing she'd kept alive entirely through her own intention, and that she'd nearly killed it twice in the first year before she slowed down and figured out what it actually needed rather than what she'd assumed it needed. I think about that sometimes more than I probably should. The difference between caring for something based on assumptions and caring for it based on what it's actually communicating. Paying attention to the signals it's genuinely giving rather than the ones you've decided it must be giving. She's good at the second one, better than almost anyone I know. She's taught me to get better at it. I'm still learning. I think she is too. I think that's probably fine. Have you ever had someone say something completely ordinary to you and realize afterward it had rearranged something in you that you didn't know was movable? Or have you spent time working very hard to explain away a feeling that was clearly the actual feeling all along? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.